Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at adding and subtracting integers. So you'll notice I've got a series of green circles and red circles here. And throughout this video we will use these to help represent positive and negative integers. So each of these green circles will represent a positive 1. And each of these red circles will represent a negative 1. So whenever we see a green circle, we know we've got a positive 1, and a red circle would be a negative 1. So let's look at a simple example, just standard addition, right? If I have 3 plus 2, we could show that as adding 3 positive 1s, right? Here's 3, and I'm adding 2 more to that. Okay, so if I take 3 and I add 2 to that, we will see that we now have 5. And that's pretty straightforward because we know that 3 plus 2 does indeed equal 5. Now let's look at an example of subtracting. So this time I have 3 and I'm going to subtract a positive 2. So in other words, I'm going to take 2 of these away, right? So we'll take 2 of these away. And what does that leave me with? Well, it leaves me with just 1. So 3 minus 2 equals 1. Again, this is review. This is stuff that we already know how to do. So now let's look at what happens when I add negatives. So here I've got a negative 3 and another negative 3, and I'm going to add those two together. So if I take negative 3 and I add another negative 3, you'll see that I end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they're all negative. So negative 3 plus a negative 3 equals negative 6. So let's notice that. If I were to do something similar, let's say negative 2 plus negative 2, what would I get? I would get negative 4. So we may see a pattern here, right? Anytime negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 4, anytime I'm adding integers that have the same sign, so either adding 2 positive numbers or adding 2 negative numbers, the result is just addition. So in other words, if I have 2 plus 2, I know that that's 4. That's the same thing as positive 2 plus positive 2 equals positive 4. And if I'm adding 2 integers with the same sign, even if they're negative, negative 2 plus negative 2, that equals negative 4. So when you are adding integers that have the same sign, just add them together and the sign stays the same. So for the first example, this was positive 2 plus positive 2, and I got positive 4. And in the second example, I have negative 2 plus negative 2, and that's negative 4. Let's look at what happens when we add different signs. So now I've got 7, and I'm adding a negative 3. So how could I solve this one? I've got 7, and I'm going to add a negative 3 to it. Let's see what happens if I move 3 negative ones over here. Well, one thing we may notice, right, let's think about this. If I have a 1, a positive 1, and a negative 1, those are going to cancel each other out. In other words, 1 minus 1 equals 0. So every time we have a positive 1 and a negative 1, that equals 0. And in fact, we can call that pair a 0 pair. So in other words, we'll see here, right? These guys here, they equal 0. So I could go ahead and remove that. Right, I've got a 0 pair, so I'll take that away. I've got another 0 pair here, and another 0 pair here. Right, so all of those guys just equal 0. Because you can see I've got 3 positive 1s and 3 negative 1s over here. So that all equals 0, and it just leaves me with these 4 positive 1s here. So 7 plus negative 3 equals a positive 4. So you may see that this is the same thing as 7 minus 3 equals 4. So when we add integers that have different signs, we're actually just going to find the difference between those two numbers. In other words, we're going to subtract. So if I have 7 plus negative 3, I can do 7 minus 3, and that equals 4. Now let's look at another example just to reiterate this. If I have negative 3 plus positive 5. Okay, once again, when we're adding integers that have different signs, we can subtract to find the difference. So in this case, 5 minus 3, I know the difference between those two numbers is 2. Okay, and this time, we're going to use whatever sign is next to the larger number. So in other words, I've got a negative 3, and I have a positive 5. Now I know that 5 is larger than 3, so I'm going to have a positive sign for this number. In other words, negative 3 plus positive 5 equals positive 2. Okay, you could always draw out your picture here too. If we start with a negative 3, and we're going to add a positive 5, once again, we could remove all of our 0 pairs. So I've got a red one and a green one, a red one and a green one, and a red one and a green one. And that leaves us with a positive 2. Finally, we're going to look at some subtraction of integers here. So let's look at this. We've got 2, and we're subtracting a negative 3. So if you remember from our earlier example with subtraction, right, when we did 5 minus 3, right, you could start with 5 and just take 3 away. Well, this time I'm not taking away a positive 3, I'm taking away a negative 3. And if I look at this picture here, I don't see a negative 3 that I can take away. But we can apply that same knowledge that we just used with our 0 pairs to help us out here. So in other words, for every one negative 1 that I add, if I add a positive 1, then I still have 2 here. In other words, right, this right here represents 2. This here is 0, and we know that 2 plus 0 equals 2. So I still have 2 to start with. Now I'm going to continue doing that until I have enough negative 3's to take away. So if I were to add another 0 pair here, and another, you'll see that I still have 2 to begin with, because I have 2 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0. But now you'll see that I actually have 3 negative 1's that I could take away. So I start with 2, and I'm going to subtract negative 3, and what do I end up with? I end up with a positive 5. So 2 minus negative 3 equals 5. And you may notice that that's the same thing as 2 plus 3 equals 5. So generally speaking, one of the easiest ways when working with integer subtraction, one of the easiest ways to solve is just to change both the sign of your operation, so changing subtraction to addition, and then also changing your negative to a positive or positive to a negative for this second number. So changing this here. In other words, let's look at another example. Okay, so we showed that 2 minus negative 3 was the same as 2 plus positive 3, and that equals 5. So let's look at another example. If we had negative 5 minus positive 2, okay, once again, we can stick with negative 5 as our starting number, and we'll change subtraction to addition, and we can change that addition sign to subtraction. Sorry, we can change that positive integer to a negative integer. So we get negative 5 plus negative 2 for a total of negative 7. So that's just a quick look at adding and subtracting integers.